Hey, a little while ago in my comments section, there was a guy who was formerly named Elijah G3Y. I'm going to be referring to him as Elijah throughout this video since that's how I knew about him first. But he now goes by Elijah Brown X8E and also goes by Doomfan1993 and also goes by Romero. Lots of names, this guy. But he told me that he was in the middle of writing something a long time ago. Now, unfortunately, I can't find the original comment, even after searching all of my published comments and even after scouring my YouTube community page to find all of the comments posted by both of his two accounts. But regardless, I was and still am excited because I want to give back to my audience, an audience who makes this guy with ideas feel heard. An audience that leaves me criticisms and feedbacks and loves. I want to give back to my community. I want all of you to write with me. I want all of us to learn. I want all of us to engage in our passion. I want to engage with my audience and read cool stories. So, yeah. Today I've got something a little bit more thematic to my channel because even though I don't always keep my videos writing related, I sort of brand myself as a writing channel, so this has been something that I've been excited about for a while. I talked with Elijah when he left his initial comment about his project, and he gave me permission. He gave me the green light, the go-ahead to go and make a video about his writing, regardless of my opinion. And that is something that I automatically respect. He could have literally submitted like 3 words, and I would have been like, good job, bro. Because it takes guts. A lot of the stuff that I write, I just want to throw away. A lot of the stuff that I write, I think is garbage, even if it's good. So it takes a lot of guts to say, I want somebody who may or may not get a bunch of views on this to give me a public critique. And that is why I wanted him to go first. Because he was very vocal, very adamant about the fact that he was proud of it. So here you go, Elijah. Let's analyze what I read, starting with a summary of your story. The story is called Fighting Water, and it is only 3 chapters long so far, so it's a pretty short read, which means I heavily encourage you to click on the link in the description of this video and go read it yourself first. With almost 6,500 words in total, it should not take you very long, but I want you to keep in mind, it is an unfinished story. Don't expect a ton of polish, and don't expect a lot of your questions to be answered, because it is in its infancy. Now, this piece is sort of like a sci-fi, pseudo-dystopia, dark fantasy, psychological drama hybrid. It's very ambitious, to say the least. There are a lot of things going on. To start with, there are multiple types of fantasy races that are all set in a sort of modern future dystopia world, which can open a lot of doors. We begin with this guy, a giant. His name is Mosh, and Mosh wakes up lightheaded on a boat heading to an island called the Agagi. In real life, the Agagi was an ancient Spartan education and training system for boys aged 7 until usually their mid-20s, according to Wikipedia. Now, on this boat, he meets, as I will call her, his sidekick, Lady. Lady is a very excited, very juvenile, naive little human girl. She's sort of like Mosh's foil, his polar opposite. The SpongeBob to his Squidward in a way. See, Mosh is rather broody, socially awkward, sort of confused and anxious, while Lady, on the other hand, is energetic, sure, and spunky. Even the most basic of questions from Lady, like, well, what's your favorite color, sends Mosh into a short mental spiral about what his answer should be instead of what it is. Now, the two land on the Agagi, where they are handed schedules that read the following tasks from 6:30 a.m. to 11 p.m., which automatically lets you know that they are going to be worked to the bone. Wake up, eat breakfast, free time, meet at lecture hall, first, second, third block, lunch, fourth block, gladiatorial combat, dragon training, cabin time, mile run, cabin time, fire ceremony, cabin time, lights out. It's very strictly run. Very schedule oriented. The Agagi is like a vague mixture of about like 15% military boot camp academy and like 85% dystopian sort of fantasy school. Mosh almost immediately finds himself a distaste for the authorities that be. They seem absurd and contradictory lots of the time. He's distasteful for authority, but also his peers. See, he's like a black sheep. He, at one point, sits down to have lunch with some other giants, and he is sort of singled out by them because they are a lot less eloquent, more meat-headed, a lot more crude than he is. But regardless, later on, he and Lady are singled out and brought to one General Arnold. Exactly why they are singled out is unclear, but they are introduced to a horrific monster called the Endal. An evolutionary marvel, it is one of many, and it is going to spark the extinction of all other races. Its supremacy is evident. It is a threat. Now, something that stuck with me is that one of these Endal creatures, caged and shown to Lady and Mosh, murmurs, "He knows." But whoever he is and whatever that means is unknown. Shortly after that, Lady and Mosh pick out weapons to salvage a dragon from a so-called dragon cave. That is their mission. A briefing from General Arnold concludes with the line, "And if you get into an interaction with a dragon, pray for forgiveness." And this gets Mosh down a very overly philosophical religious spiral that crescendos with what I can only describe as a rampage. He infiltrates the dragon cave alone, losing Lady along the way. And there's a violent outburst from what reads like hundreds of dragons coming out of nowhere. He's utterly frenzied and in a rage and terror. Here's a quote. "I killed the rest of them, with every bloody stroke of my weapon painting the cave walls with blood like an abstract piece of Goya." One of the dragons mutters, "Must prevent." The story so far ends with Mosh standing over the gore of his rampage, haunted by his own actions, just repeating the phrase, "It could happen again," over and over and over again, which might suggest something about his past, or maybe he's just expressing simple dread for what this means for his future, sort of like saying, "I've got to fight to survive now," in a way. With the summary out of the way, let's move on to the rest of my thoughts. This is actually the second draft of my critiques, which just goes to show that I have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of passion. I'm pretty invested in your story. So bear with me, Elijah, as I try to contain myself a little bit. And I would just like to remind everybody, that these are all just suggestions. Further, they're suggestions and questions and tips from a unpublished, non-expert, who just happens to read and write a lot. You have the right, as the author and as the audience, to ignore any and all feedback here with no harm done, no hurt feelings. I'll only cry in the shower a little bit. I am not here to tell you you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, I don't like this, completely scrap this. What I'm here to do is I'm here to tell you what I want to see. So to start, I think your story is ambitious, like I said before. It has a lot that it wants to do. It wants to blend your themes and genres. It wants to show people why you should always question authority by highlighting contradictions and hostility in institutions, namely the military and education. It wants to tap into some existential dread and fear of the unknown, specifically of growing up. It ultimately has its roots in a religious, philosophical, coming-of-age story. However, Elijah, in broadening your horizons so vastly, I think your story misses the mark on a lot of what it wants to talk about. You miss out on some things that could really, truly make your story special. In other words, since you try to do so much, it doesn't feel like you end up doing a whole lot very spectacularly throughout your 6,000 words. So, my critiques are going to involve the following things. 1, the literal writing itself. 2, your style and characterization. 3, your genre and themes. And 4, your overall structure. Section 1, the literal writing itself. So let's just get this part out of the way first and then move on to some more important things, but your grammar. There are portions of this story that have a narrative punch to them, that feel in character, and are dripping with the skill that it took to write. There is obvious knowledge of how to craft your words on display. For a few examples, we have the crashing of the waves produces a melodic drum of insanity. That is poetic. That is sensory. Love it. I had always heard silence, but I had never felt silence. Classic. Also very sensory. That is a lived-in sentence. And my personal favorite here, the island was a titan on life support. Alive, but still and quiet, but not silent. I love these lines. Like I said, they are punchy. They are descript and full of life. They make the world feel more alive by being clever and lived in. Your prose are very occasionally very clever, yet I've noticed, Elijah, that your favorite punctuation mark is the comma. This can make your prose seem less clever and more like frantic when it's not warranted. Even my favorite line could be improved, more flowy, by making it multiple lines like so. The island was a titan on life support, period. It's still. It's quiet, comma, but not silent. It's alive. Barely alive, M dash, but alive. See, doesn't that sound a little bit more snappy? More polished? You want to break it apart based on what thought is being thunk. Because I'll tell you something, people very rarely speak in fragments and run-ons. So it's grating to actually read them. Humans typically save a sentence for a complete thought, not 3 or 4 thoughts. There are many points where your sentences, your paragraphs, sometimes pages, just break standard writing norms but without a clear purpose. Writing norms are not rules, obviously, we know this. They're just suggestions. They can be ignored. But just realize that they are good suggestions. During sections that are terror-driven or involve a mental spiraling of some sort, it is completely normal to have fragmented and run-on thoughts. But, comma. Run-on sentences and fragments typically sound frantic and panicky. It's a little less normal in a normal, boring classroom or a cafeteria setting, though. Perfectly apt when dragon hunting, but not so normal when first meeting lady. If I were you, I would try to revisit each of my chapters, read it out loud once or twice. In my computer science classes, there's this method for bug finding called rubber ducking. And rubber ducking literally just involves buying a small rubber duck to put on your desk to explain your bug, or in your case, reading your story out until you find things to fix. And it helps me to find all my mistakes and to see how things flow. Does it read like prose that are from a human being, or does it read like manufactured prose? See what reads naturally, see what doesn't, and fix it accordingly. So, sticking with the critique on the writing, let's move to a slightly broader topic. And I'll save a lot of this for when we talk about characterization, but I think it's important to mention a few things here. I have collected a few mentions and references to more modern, non-universally understandable comparisons. See, a comparison, a simile or metaphor or what have you, shouldn't just be used without justification. I often use comparisons to evoke a new thought or progress a thought that already exists, to show understanding between two characters, or even as a shortcut to audience understanding. Obviously, there's more than one reason to make a comparison. We are humans. We work in comparisons 24/7, although oftentimes your writing feels non-universal and or clunky to read. Mosh at one point compares his brain to, quote, a game engine struggling to process 500 different and unique assets all at once. This rogue comparison feels like an intrusion on your story more than anything. It feels like you, the author, saying, guys, this is a thing I know about. See, the story doesn't have previous mentions of virtual reality, gaming, or other techie talk. That's not where its roots lie. It seems totally unrelated to the story, and it therefore feels like it. It is as if I were picked up out of your story to ponder a different set of circumstances just to be put right back into the story like nothing happened when I was done. It feels like a natural liminal space, Mosh says to himself later. These sorts of things can often go over the heads of people who are a little bit more antiquated, older. Someone may not know what a game engine struggling looks like since they either don't play games at all or only play games that work. People less acquainted with the internet culture and the meme speak won't appreciate stuff like this, or, certain things we'll get to a little bit later. Think of comparisons like this. There's almost like this uncanny valley for comparisons. Something can be way too specific to feel fluid, but not specific enough to feel human. The number 500 is a bit too specific for a clear understanding, and that number, it lacks character. If he said a gazillion assets, that wouldn't change a thing. That would still feel at least a little more fluid by showing exaggeration. It would feel more like a character moment instead of this rogue comparison. A good comparison should serve some sort of purpose without alienating your audience. So try to use comparisons that you might hear in more everyday speech. Instead of game engine and liminal space, you could try these. Time felt slower. My brain felt like an old, ungreased machine. And then you could try this. This isn't real. It felt like I was dreaming. So really the only major downside of the writing itself is the use, or lack thereof, of grammar consistency and the use of weird comparisons. I just ask that you keep your audience in mind and try to sharpen this sort of stuff. Section 2. Characterization and style. Lady is my favorite, and it's not even close, but let's discuss all of your characters. There's a lot of rich stuff here to talk about. I like the names you give the two main characters. I feel like with your naming structure, you are very on the nose with pretty much everything, which at least to me reads as quirky and skillful, somewhat endearing. Others might call it superfluous, but I really do find the charm in it. Calling this racial supremacist enemy the end-all has a ring to it. They are the end-all for everyone else. Genius! Calling this spunky little lady, absolute cinema. Calling a character who's coming face to face with the violence and the frenzy that this world demands, mosh, is slightly more subtle, but still a very, very fitting move. I just suggest that you don't go overboard with it. Solace might be a little bit too on the nose for a fire witch elf, Solace, soul, the sun. But moving on. I'd like to say that your style for lots of your characters needs work. Even my favorite character isn't totally consistent. The first question you should always ask yourself when introducing a new character is, what is this character? The second should be, why should the audience care? And then you should keep your characters true to both answers, even if you don't like those answers. Even if the answers are, they are narratively useless and the audience shouldn't care about them. So let's start with my favorite. Lady is super eccentric, super excited, and most of all, unbothered by pretty much anything. But sometimes she borders on pixie dust and glitter in what is otherwise a moody, surreal change for our POV character. There is supposed to be this dread on the way to this military training island. But one of the first lines she gets is a spasm of words all in a row. Hiya, stranger! What's your favorite color? What's your favorite food? What's your favorite plant? What's your favorite animal? What's your favorite this? What's your favorite that? And you see, this example is a pet peeve of mine. Because Mosh is our POV character. And we are supposed to be in this moody, surreal state with him. But we are broken out by just the first words. Hiya, stranger! That rubs me the wrong way. See, people very rarely greet themselves so aggressively to a new person, but that reads with style. I can forgive that. Even though hi, hello, how are you, good morning are more natural greetings, hiya stranger tells us a lot about this character before we even meet her. But with the spasm of questions afterward, what's your favorite color, what's your favorite food, what's your favorite plant, what color underwear are you wearing, what's your social security number, give me your credit card, etc., even people with a little bit more razzmatazz tend to avoid laying it on quite so thick. This dialogue is thick, and lots of ladies' dialogue is very, very thick. Furthermore, I think you aren't necessarily consistent with her. After her introduction, I expected more of that SpongeBob Squidward dynamic. However, those Mosh's foil qualities fall to the wayside when they go dragon hunting, and suddenly she knows more than she was letting on without any explanation. She points out the magic inscription on weapons, but how does she know this? How much does she know? So, think about what she is supposed to be. Is she Mosh's foil? Is she a naive, slightly annoying social butterfly to offset Mosh's awkwardness? Is she more like Mosh's guide through the Agagi? What is her purpose exactly? Is it twofold even? But if it is twofold, you might want to weave it better. So just think more carefully about all of your characters. Now, I don't know how to explain this next problem I have very well, but I'm going to try. With the exception of Mosh and Lady, your other characters don't really feel like characters, but more like, I'll say, cameos. For example, Mosh is introduced to one particular twin elf with magic fire hands during the lunch scene. Now, obviously, I know I shouldn't judge things that are not your writing, but looking at some of the comments on your Wattpad page, I saw quotes like, "It's me," and "I love Solace so much. My baby is so smart." These comments, and the fact that Solace doesn't really do much throughout the story, leads me to believe that he is a fan service character. Solace is to the reader like me what Stan Lee is to a Marvel fan. And I guess I'm not a Marvel fan. I get the feeling that some of your writing is not for general audiences, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself. You are allowed to write things for and with whoever you want. But this Solace character does not enhance the plot or serve a narrative function at all. They're a brief comic relief, and that's about it. In a classroom scene, they yell "chicken jockey" unprompted. So yeah, it's important to realize who your audience is, and is this for a close-knit community or for a wider audience? That is a question you need to ask yourself. A general audience, like me, wouldn't really appreciate inserts that don't serve the plot, especially when I don't know them. The deeper themes and any singular purpose is tantamount. You should always be serving your story before you serve the fans. It has been said, your story is not finished when you have nothing to add, but when you have nothing to take away. So, if it were me, I would cut the unnecessary fan-servicey characters, or just wait to introduce them when they actually serve a function. On top of that, enhance the style of these characters you have now. One way to do this would be to design your characters more specifically, make them stand out a little bit more. Which actually leads me to my next topic, your genre and theme, section 3. Let's expand slightly and look at how your characters relate to your genres. I think the blending of genre, the real-world, future-world setting with fantasy races intertwined is an interesting concept. The inclusion of witches and giants and halflings in a slightly dystopian setting is something you very rarely see. It's very similar to how my friends and I would prefer to structure our custom D&D campaigns. We often prefer a sort of modern-ish story that can open a lot of doors. Think kind of like a on-world Star Wars plot. However, my main problem with this choice, Elijah, is that it doesn't really feel that intentional. Even though multiple races exist and some even exhibit strange powers, namely Solace has fire hands, they never really do anything with their uniqueness. Their races don't seem to bring any quirks, no strengths, no weaknesses, and that feels counterintuitive. Their differences don't make them different. What I mean is that, while reading, I had completely forgotten Mosh was a giant at least 3 times. Unless the current sentence reminded me, I would almost always read him as just a regular human guy. In fact, I did a thought experiment. I plugged all 3 of your chapters into ChatGPT, and I asked it to generate me a image of Mosh and Lady, and it came out with just a regular dude and a regular girl, all both the same size. So here's where we hone back in on the specifics of your story. The reasons why your character feel a little bit generic is twofold. Firstly, we are never given a proper description of him, Lady, or anybody else. So I just imagine them as 2 grayish sort of blobs. But more importantly, despite the fact that he is a giant, his size is never an issue. To stylize these characters a little more, you should be thinking firstly about their purpose, but further, show what makes them different. Give them some descriptive features, some pros, cons, abilities, disabilities, likes and dislikes, and drawbacks especially. More importantly than the individual characters, Elijah, is intentionality. Ultimately, a majority of my critiques can boil down to just be more intentional, bro. Which I feel isn't good enough. Because how do I be more intentional? That advice is way too vague. So let me get a little bit more specific. Firstly, I think you really need to sit down and you need to ask yourself, do these fantasy races in my story play a major role? Do they serve my genre? Do they serve my theme? Do they serve my plot? I, the reader, can forgive you if it's just too early for these different races to play a major part or be that relevant. We're still getting our bearings, really. But going on chapter 4 without a clear answer to that question is pushing it. Ask yourself, are these fantasy elements spicy details, or are they relevant to my story? For a bit more clarity and a bit more of a grounded example, it might make sense to signpost why exactly Mosh doesn't quite fit in. If you wanted to give his giant status some sort of narrative momentum, you could explain why he is anxious, why he's the broody creature that he is, why is he different from the other giants. If the fantasy aspect plays a crucial role, perhaps he's awkward because he's metaphorically and literally not fitting in. Perhaps he doesn't fit in with most of the others because he is too short to fit in with the other giants, but he's too tall to fit in with anybody else. In other fantasy stories, different races typically have different cultures and different norms. Elves are high class and aristocratic. Dwarves are dirty and gruff. And goblins are ugly and greedy. There's no expectations to stick to these tropes as rules, but I want you to acknowledge that they exist for reasons. Good reasons. To show a divide for one reason or another. To make the differences feel different. And then think about how this relates to your themes, too. Typically, dystopian stories have a kind of defeatist tone. They're often cynical and critical and angry. They often promote stepping away from the pack and going your own way to make a difference. Think Hunger Games, 1984, the Divergent series. Fight for what you believe in, even when it's hard, even when you're fighting alone, is the core message of a lot of dystopian stories. Fantasy, in contrast, is typically meant to show the strength in unity, in diversity. Instead of going it alone, you're pairing up. When one person's shortcomings are on display, another person has their back. A dwarf is too short to reach the top shelf, the giant comes in. In The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship brings together humans, dwarves, elves, hobbits, and a wizard to solve a problem and grow around their cultural divides. Fight for good, even if it's with someone you hate, is the moral of a lot of fantasy stories. So just keep in mind what you're trying to do with the inclusion of your fantasy elements, with your dystopian themes. Do they all serve a purpose later on? And more importantly, should they? So let's back up a little bit. Remember how I said earlier that some of your dialogue can pull the reader out of your story to ponder something completely unrelated before just dropping them right back in? Well, some of your monologues do this too, especially that religious spiral near the end of chapter 3. Now, big disclaimer, I am a Christian too. It is not bad, it is not wrong to include religious or philosophical themes. That is actually one of my favorite things. Having a character ponder existential things of that nature is in some of the most popular and some of my favorite works of all time. Christian themes in Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, Elden Ring, Adam and Eve's Diaries, Paradise Lost. Hell, the book I'm working on right now has some allegories to the Garden of Eden. However, I do not think that yours is integrated with much grace. It is not your content that is the issue. It is your delivery. See, this story is not just a story, it is a journey. We should feel like we are walking a journey with Mosh and Lady, not attending a lecture by Dr. Mosh. In that chapter 3 monologue, we don't see Mosh wrestling with one big idea in a moment of doubt or fear. Instead, we are met with a barrage of loosely connected theological questions all at once, similar to Lady's introduction. Before Mosh has really done anything bad or good, he starts questioning whether or not he'll go to heaven or hell. Then he questions the validity of the Bible's teachings. Then he questions why hell even exists. Then he asks if bad people can go to heaven if they love Jesus. He begins to wonder if sin is human or godly, which I don't quite understand. I think he's asking if God created sin. He recalls the first sin ever committed. He questions what is the point of Jesus, etc., etc., etc. What I'm saying is this: a strong theme does not need to be shouted to be heard. See, these aren't necessarily bad questions, but they come without build-up or any emotional scaffolding. They don't really relate to one big narrative through line in this scene, and it doesn't really feel like a natural evolution of Mosh's thoughts. It feels like the author, you Elijah, has grabbed the mic and now you're talking. You can still explore complex ideas, but you need to do it through the actions, the relationships, and the decisions that are made throughout your story. Let the reader feel the philosophy by living it alongside the character. We should be discovering meaning in tandem with Mosh. We should not be pulled aside for a solo TED Talk and let him just describe his thoughts. If the ideas are well integrated, even a casual reader will pick up on them. They don't need to be hidden, but they do need to be earned. And right now, the story pauses to think out loud when it should be moving forward with a clearer purpose. You should weave your theme seamlessly. That's all I'm saying. The story itself should be your main focus. Section 4. Your structure. Now, this is my last critique, and it's probably going to be my shortest, because for the most part, you have decent structure. I've discussed how the specific structures, like your characters or your dialogues, can feel a little bit clunky or unintuitive. That chicken jockey dialogue, the game engine thing, Lady's spasm of questions, Mosh's spasm of questions. However, there are a few scenes that progress unnaturally and don't really make sense when you think about them. And sometimes they don't just progress unnaturally, they arise unnaturally. See, you should always aim to have your story feel like it is progressing in some way. It should feel like the characters are going somewhere to do something new for some reason. But sometimes it feels more like we're moving back and forth between locations aimlessly. Recall that scene where General Arnold talks to Lady and Mosh specifically about the Endal that the military has captured. This, in my mind, arises unnaturally because we are never told why. Mosh and Lady feel like they are chosen to learn this stuff because they're the main characters, not because they actually earned it. But worse still, when they are done, he ends by letting them just go to class, and then he just calls them right back in to apologize for letting them go too early. When you run into these sorts of situations, it might be in your best interest to just restructure your story a little bit. Move stuff around to make, first of all, your dialogue, and second of all, the structure a little bit cleaner. Instead of saying, and I quote, "I almost forgot about this, so do forgive me, cadets. I'm just a man." You could have made them go to their class and get pulled out either halfway through or afterwards, and then have one big scene where General Arnold kind of info dumps to them. This would serve General Arnold's character by making him a stronger, more put-together guy. He doesn't make these little mistakes. Or actually, he does, but what I mean is, he shouldn't make these little mistakes. He doesn't repeat himself. Show up when requested, listen to me, and then go and do what you're told. I'm not repeating myself. That would be his character. But instead, he feels almost goofy, and with a name like General Arnold, you cannot afford to be, dangling his reputation on a string like that. You want your military to feel powerful, to feel structured. But other than that initial structure, that schedule that Mosh gets upon arrival, there is very little structure at all, and this scene is evidence of that. I see the vision, Elijah, I see it. But it might be in your best interest to demystify the military a little bit. Have a scene similar to that cadet scene in Attack on Titan. Have, like, a Commandant Shadis weed out the weak and enforce order. Explain what they're all there to do early on and how they're going to do it. Are there branches to this military? If so, are they non-standard? Is everybody here to be a warrior? Or are some of them more like technicians? Or some of them scouts? Or some of them like something else? You know what I mean? We currently have a briefing scene with just Mosh and Lady, but again, why them? Why only them exactly? Why are these two random cadets chosen to go on a dangerous dragon hunting mission instead of an experienced combat troop? Why not have Solace go with them maybe? Actually give some purpose to that character. So try to ground your story a little bit more in the details so that the structure becomes clearer. And do not be afraid to move things around to flow more naturally. You are allowed to move things around. Don't feel locked in just because a word is on the page. In conclusion, your story has a good start, but it is missing quite a few things that could really elevate it. To recap my thoughts, it may be worth revisiting your storyboard and considering your genre, your themes, and your setting more carefully. You don't want it to just be the stage that your story appears on, but actively part of your story as well. Furthermore, it would definitely be worth the time and consideration to look at the roles and the attributes of your characters in your story. Strengths, skills, weaknesses, shortcomings, likes and dislikes, and purposes. What are their roles especially? Then, when that is done, you should try to make your conversation feel a little bit more natural. Spend more time fleshing out and logically flowing from one topic to another in either conversation, in Mosh's internal monologue, or just in a scene in general. Try not to turn your characters, namely Lady, into caricatures of what you probably want. And lastly, try to tighten up your writing to be a little bit more weighty. I know you can do it. I've seen it in your story. You are a pretty good writer. But right now, a lot of your story reads as pretty amateurish. There is a lot that is good. Not just good, but stylish. And I will tell you something. Style is one of the most important things you can have. Style can make up for something that is bad. Absolutely. And that is not to imply that your story is bad. Like I said, it is good. But you're missing out on style points. You need style points. So if I may offer one last critique to close the video, given the way that you use humor and your characters in your story, I might even make this a comic book. I might not make this a like novel or a book in the traditional sense. Honestly, I don't think it really earns the right to be a novel or a book in the traditional sense, because a lot of the dialogue is kind of witty and comical. And honestly, a lot of what is missing is just some of the details. So if the details could be made up visually, that would help the story a lot. Now, I'm not saying go and change everything, but I'm just saying I could see this as a comic book. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing this with me, Elijah. Sharing this with all of us, rather. I hope that this was all pretty useful advice, and if you disagree with certain parts or all of it, remember, I'm not a professional. You are allowed to disagree with me. This is just what I would like to see from your story. So if you or anyone else in the audience feel as if I have missed something important or I'm completely wrong, please let me know. I'd love to argue with you guys. Just obviously keep things respectful. Thanks, everybody.